Now, it's widely accepted that achieving carbon neutrality or net zero emissions has become key in the fight against climate change. However, markets and businesses will be profoundly affected by this shift. Costs and benefits, like it or not, are going to be unequally distributed across countries, regions, sectors, and populations. Today, we have two roundtables looking at this theme. The first is focused on finance and public policy, and the second takes a look at businesses that are already preparing for this transition. But before we get started, let's take a look at a short video. Now, for the first of our sessions, please join me in welcoming Sylvie Goulard, Deputy Governor of the Banque de France, and also Mary Burce Warlick, Deputy Executive Director of the International Energy Agency. Welcome to both of you. Thank you very much for being with us. Now, I'm going to start with you, Mary. The Net Zero by 2050 flagship report from the International Energy Agency provides clear indications of what we need to do, perhaps most importantly, what we need to stop doing to reach net zero emissions. Can you summarise some of the key points that have highlighted in this report?
Yes, of course, I'd be very happy to, and thanks for having me here today and having the opportunity to represent some of the IEA's analysis on this area. Let me just start by saying our analysis shows that the pathway to net zero emission trajectory by 2050 is narrow, but it's still feasible, and I think that's really important. But in order to get there, we'll need to reduce global emissions significantly by about 14 gigatons by 2030. And just to give you some sense of this, it's roughly equivalent to what the coal sector emitted in 2021 when we registered historic highs in emissions. So it's not trivial, but again, we believe it's doable. But we really need to make this decade, the decade of intensive and significant clean energy expansion, and that's the important challenge here. In our analysis, it's going to require achieving a few specific milestones through significant scaling up. To begin with, under our net zero emission scenario, the electricity sector gets to net zero first by 2030 by a quadrupling of solar and wind expansion seen in 2020. So again, daunting, but feasible with real focus. And we've already seen exponential growth in solar and wind. Second, a massive surge in electrification enables us then to decarbonize homes and cars. And this is where more work needs to be done. By 2030, EVs need to be 60% of car sales. That's 10 times more than 2020 when they were about 6%. But some countries really are making good progress in EV sales. And a really big push needs to be made in energy efficiency. Some of you may know there was a big ministerial level energy efficiency meeting sponsored by the IEA in Denmark just yesterday, so we're really trying to focus on that. Among other things, 1 in 5 buildings needs to be retrofitted, so big amount of work needs to be done there, and that's up from about 1 in 20 today. Big job, but big opportunities. And third, in terms of financing, we need to see a substantial scale up in clean energy investments, so that's where we think many of you will need to come in. Today, in the past few years, I should say about $1 trillion annually is currently being invested in clean energy technologies. But in a net zero pathway by 2030, the level of annual investment in clean energy will need to quadruple. So we're talking around $4 trillion US dollars annually by 2030. And this is going to require about 1.3 trillion in renewables in the electricity sector, specifically, another 900 billion in clean energy infrastructure. This goes to high-performing electricity networks, charging stations, hydrogen refueling stations, and so on. And 1.7 trillion in end-use sectors. So we're talking about the retrofitting of buildings I mentioned, industrial process upgrades, low-emission vehicles, and so on. To your question, what can investors do to contribute? If I can just turn to that. This massive increase in investment cannot be met by public resources alone, particularly in emerging and developing economies, where they're already very dependent on public financing. The majority of investment will need to come from private sources and very much mobilized, we understand, by the right public policies and the regulatory sphere and so on. But investors, we think, really can play an important role in supporting the private sector and mobilizing the financing. It's a big challenge, but we think with the right focus we can get there. Things like sustainable bond issuances and climate-conscious investing can certainly help to mobilize some of this capital into the clean energy sectors and support the transitions in carbon-intensive industries. Thank you.
You say it's a big challenge, and there's some big numbers there, lots of billions and trillions in there. Turning to you, Sylvie, how do the physical and transition risks due to climate change affect financial stability, particularly in the current economic slowdown?
So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. So I represent here not only the Banque de France, but we have the chance to have the secretariat of a network of central banks created in 2017, the Network for Greening the Financial System. You may have heard about it. And we are now more than 100 central banks and supervisors worldwide. Already in 2019, we published our first report where we stated very clearly and altogether that climate-related risks are financial risks. On this, there is no doubt. But as you are all investors, I would also like to underline the fact that there are lots of business opportunities in such a transformation. So we need you to invest properly, because the decisions we can take on risk will not provide the solutions. It is obvious for the physical risk. I suppose that I should say, give you all the numbers for insurance company, but I'm just going to say something else. Look at the map of heating and think about the wine you enjoy when you are in France, in Italy, and in these countries. The changes in agriculture, the changes in our way of life will be so huge that we need to tackle this challenge. So it is real, it is serious. You all know the IPCC reports. I appreciate very much the work you do, Mary, and I use your charts to show that we are far from reaching the targets, because there is a risk right now, which is not a financial one, which is a political, psychological one. Many governments made pledges, it's great. Many companies committed, it's great. But when people commit for 2050, I'm a little bit skeptical. The ones taking the commitment will not be there anymore, or not in charge, so we have to be careful on this. So we have the commitments. There is an awareness, and as Mary said, it is feasible, but it requires such an amount of work. And one last word, if I may, on that. You said in the slowdown, etc. Keep in mind something simple. We all see what the war in Ukraine is, what it means for the economy. But the fight against climate change is an invisible war. The magnitude is very large, and unfortunately, we have to face both together. We did everything we could in all multilateral organizations with others, with emerging economies. They are very important in tackling climate change to get global agreements. The movie showed it is global. No one can do it alone. We need the Americans on board, we need Asia, we need Africa, we need everybody on board. And to get where we would like to go, we need more cooperation, not less, and I don't need to describe the situation, the geopolitical one right now. So the private sector has a role to play. You can whisper to your governments. Governments are in the front line, of course, above all in democracies. We don't pretend as central banks that we can replace public decisions on taxes, on pricing of carbons, on incentives, etc. But we will do our best, and we will do everything in our own monetary portfolio, in the supervisory field, in the macroprudential approach, and in monetary policy. The decision was taken by the central bank last year in Europe, July 2021, to green the monetary policy, which is a big piece. And we are not sure that it's going to be easy. The road will be bumpy, but we are committed to achieve it. Thank you.
Now, you've just touched on 2 points, that we need cooperation. At the same time, there's an ongoing conflict on Europe's doorstep, which makes this more challenging than ever. What's the likely impact of the global energy crisis, and what role can the IEA play in this?
Well, thank you very much for that as well. And I'm sure everyone in the audience, of course, is very well aware of the huge challenges in global energy markets in countries all around the world, and the significant increases in prices for fossil fuels rising 3 to 7 times compared to what we saw in October 2020. So this is all, I know, not news to you. And the question really is what to do about it. We've also seen prices of critical minerals really increase significantly, and those are going to be so important for the development of clean energy technologies. So whether it's lithium, nickel, or so on, all these prices are increasing. I'll just start by saying, there are near-term challenges that we clearly need to address, and longer-term ones as well, and I think we have to keep both in mind. Obviously, we do need to respond to the immediate challenges, and specifically the energy security and economic impacts of all this. And for the IEA's part, we've taken quite a number of steps in recent months. We saw that, and we did some early warning about the possible implications of the tightness in the markets that we were seeing. But even more importantly, we moved really quite quickly to take some actions to help mitigate markets and the impacts around the world. IEA members, again, as you all may know, in both March and April, released the 2 largest emergency stocks in the history of the agency. In March, it was agreed to release 60 million barrels in terms of the emergency oil stocks over 30 days. And then yet again in early April, an announcement was made to release 120 million barrels. So all of this, or some of this, certainly with respect to the second release, is still in the course of being put onto markets. In other practical terms, we developed 2 10-point plans to reduce the EU's reliance on both Russian natural gas and oil. And these plans have very specific recommendations that were really widely read and well received. And we've subsequently been working very closely with the Commission and EU member states to help get many of those actions put in place and consistent with the EU's own Repower EU plan. So. But let me turn to the longer term, and that is, while we're addressing, and it's not necessarily the longer term, this is a question of being focused on both of our challenges. While we're addressing these immediate needs, we think it's really very important to continue to stay focused on accelerating energy transitions. Only with well-managed transitions will we be able to better manage future disruptions in the market, better take care of our energy security concerns, better address consumer needs. And yes, as I mentioned, this is going to require significant investments, so it's going to require huge political will on the part of governments, but also, as I mentioned earlier, too, accelerating and mobilizing the private sector capital too. And I'd just like to say, in addition to the 10-point plans I mentioned, the IEA is continuing its work building upon our net zero report from last year. We are working on a couple of plans relating to the pathway to net zero in both the nuclear and coal sectors. Those are reports that are going to be coming out later this month. And we're also working really closely with Indonesia on a net zero roadmap.
Can you give us a teaser on anything there?
Well, the recommendations are not yet out, but we certainly recognize that every energy sector can play its role in the effort to reduce emissions. And so it's, I think, very much in line with what you were saying. We've got to be looking for everyone to be playing their part. We also, last teaser is World Investment Energy Report. It's something we produce annually, is also coming out 22nd of June. Thank you.
Thank you. Turning to you, Sylvie, central banks, both as regulators and investors, play a crucial role. But do you believe that the instruments currently available are sufficient, or is there a need to create new tools for this new future?
No, obviously it's not sufficient. I would lie if I would say that, but we are developing new ones. We have been working very hard, once again, in this network. I take two examples. The first one is Handbook for Supervisors, because it's important that we speak the same language worldwide. For you, all of you, the more we have global standards and global approaches, common approaches, the best is it for you. So we try to make sure that we already organized in France last year. It is now going on. There is an ongoing stress test exercise in the euro area for banks. So we stress their portfolio, we try to measure the temperatures. The other thing, as I've said, is the monetary policy, which is a very important field where we try to pioneer, but we need to look at all our macro modeling, we need to look at the way we use collateral, the way we conceive haircuts, etc. I'm not going to be too technical. One word, if I may, something very important psychologically. We should not pretend that we know how to do it. We should learn by doing. We should begin. We don't have time to wait until we have the perfect tools available. But what we try to do is to have a first set of scenario and then to improve it. A first set of handbooks and then to check. And there is a reality check, and that's the reason why we need dialogue with people in the real economy.
Staying with you, Sylvie, for a moment, deep economic transformation, because that's what we're talking about right now, calls for us to revise the assumptions of models that, these assumptions rest on. Do you agree? And what's the most important assumption, perhaps, that we need to challenge right now?
Well, maybe I'm going to surprise you. I don't know if it's because we are in Paris, the city of Marcel Proust, but the main assumption is our relationship with time. We need to think long term. And at the same time, if I may say so, we need also to act immediately. So the relationship with time, which is always something difficult in our life, has to change. We are working here for our children, for our grandchildren. We want to keep this planet alive. So we need to begin right now. And I appreciate when in all your reports you say it's feasible, but if I may, it's feasible if we change. If we begin to change immediately, thinking at the same time long term. So maybe
we often say this is the decade, but we're already halfway through 2022, so this decade's already ticking along.
If I read your reports properly, you said that the emissions have to peak in the coming years. So we have at the same time, and we are the privileged ones in the world, we have energy available. So the other ones in Africa, in Asia, in South America, they need access to energy. They are numerous, so we have to make an effort to reduce it. So time is of the essence, and also maybe another relationship to consumption. But I'm not sure that we're all so happy just to consume. So it's challenging at the same time, very exciting.
Just final question for both of you. In the next panel, we're going to hear from CEOs who are preparing to steer their companies. We'd like to say they're already doing so, not preparing, to net zero. Is there any specific message that you have for them? Perhaps, Mary, you'd like to start.
Sure. Yeah, a couple of key points. Let me just mention and put a couple of statistics out there. Global net income from oil and gas production in 2022 is anticipated to be nearly $2 trillion higher than 2021. So two and a half times the average of the past 5 years. So this is a huge windfall for the oil and gas industry. And and this comes back to these whole questions of action and need for implementation, if the global oil and gas industry were to invest the additional income in low emissions fuels, such as hydrogen and biofuels, it would fund all of the investment needed in these fuels the remainder of the decade to get to net zero emissions by 2050. So it's just something to think about. We really think, the oil and gas producers are at a turning point, and this is really a once-in-a-generation opportunity to diversify their economic structures. And then second point is, we do not need to choose between the energy crisis, addressing the energy crisis, and the climate crisis. In fact, we cannot afford to ignore either. So again, as I mentioned, while we're addressing this immediate crisis, we really need to be working hard to scale up investment. And it's exactly what you said, Sylvie. It's feasible if we change, but we have to be approaching this with a sense of urgency to take action now so we get to a much better place and a more sustainable future for future generations. Thank you.
Just final comments, Sylvie, messages to the CEOs that are appearing on this stage in just a few minutes.
They know better than I what they have to do. I'm just in a central bank. But if I may, more as a matter of free, invest in the right fields. And we all should draw the lessons from the pandemic. Adaptation is something that our societies can do. We don't need to wait until there is a catastrophe to show that we can adapt. We did it. We did it, and we even produced vaccines, and we are well protected. So we can do it. So let's just do it. Thank you.
And let's put CEOs under this.